So today's perspective is really all about the supply chain. And as the title implies itself, starts with farmers, goes through to suppliers and retailers and the consumer. And as we'll talk about, the supply chain is relatively complex. It's definitely not simple. It varies across industry, it varies across country, it varies across consumer access to goods and services. But I wanted to provide a little bit different perspective here in the fact of taking a look at it a little bit backwards. And again, we always tend to process flow things from left to right here. So starting with red and ending up with green. But the perspective I'm going to show today is a little bit opposite. And it's based upon the premise that consumer demand, consumer interest, consumer attitudes, consumer perceptions are fundamentally driving the supply chain. And they're driving that supply chain into areas that focuses on the reason why we're all here, whether you want to talk about sustainability or transparency or the environment or even the relevance of social issues, which I'll mention. It's overall to force that into becoming more responsible citizens throughout the supply chain. Now, I know this is obvious to most, but on a global standpoint, as we take a look as consumer scientists around the globe, this relevance of sustainability is across consumers' lifestyles. And it's not just about food. It's about travel. It's about transportation. It's about this carpet. It's about these lights. Everything that consumers are looking at is drawing into this eco-consciousness and becoming much more meaningful, much more relevant, again, to their lifestyle. And I love the Chinese proverb, when the winds of change blow, some people will build walls, others will build windmills. So as we get a little bit more specific, as I work through the deck here, this is some new information we put out at Natural Marketing Institute. This is just US based, but I think it's very, very interesting in the fact this was really the first time that we've ever quantified the size of the consumer-based sustainability market. And again, this is consumer only. But the bottom line between the numbers here is that you're looking at a $1.5 trillion market by 2020. And that involves a variety of different types of products and services and so on, from transportation to organic apparel and cotton and so on, all interrelated here. But as I'll talk about later, this whole thought transfer of what's happening in one industry to another is highly relevant, highly useful to look at. Now let's get a little bit more specific as we talk about sustainability through the lens of a consumer. You know, to many of us in the room here, sustainability is pretty commonplace. We can use it in a sentence. We can talk about the various aspects. But to consumers, it means many different things. You can talk about anything to do here, whether you're talking about labor or waste, a lot of the stuff that Jason mentioned and was mentioned earlier. So at times, it's a really difficult concept for consumers in any geography to really understand what we're talking about. And different points along this supply chain, if you go back to the beginning slide, different topics are more meaningful and relevant and understood to some consumers than they are for others. So if you look at that across global consumer data, and basically what I'm referring to here is we've interviewed over 500,000 consumers in about 30 different countries with some consumer interviews over the past 15 years. And what we've done is we've taken a look at the notion of sustainability through this global lens. So we asked them a range of questions. And this is just a small part of a survey. I'm going to show you some various other elements of that survey. But we asked them a simple question. It's important for companies to not just be profitable, but to be mindful of their impact on the environment and society. So this is an agreement scale, so you can look at it on a variety of different terms here. And what's very, very interesting, and you can quickly break out emerging versus developed countries here. And what you see is in the developed countries, it's less relevant. So look on the left, Japan, Germany, UK, US. And it's much more important on the right-hand side if you take a look at BRIC countries in South Africa and so on. So again, there's this strong orientation, but there are some differences. In the UK, we actually asked consumers on what the countries should be doing. And I thought this was relevant. Obviously, there's the body of water surrounding, but if you ask consumers, about half of all consumers in the UK, they think the country can have a strong economic growth by focusing on green industries. That's a large portion of the population. And it's very relevant, obviously, here to why we're all convened. Now, you're going to hear from a colleague from McDonald's in the next session. And this is just noting here that there's lots of activity here across a variety of different market sectors with specific relationship to food. There's obviously food you can consume away from home, food you consume at home. There's food waste. There's a whole wide array of dimensions here. But there's some good corporate citizens and some great examples of what's happening here. Now, if you look at the U.S. numbers and you ask them a specific question, how important is it for the stores you go to grow their food on farms that practice sustainable agriculture? And there's a couple ways to look at this stat here. One is that there's been tremendous growth from 2005, basically 2014. You look at a decade worth of information. You have 6 out of 10 American consumers, almost 140 million consumers in the U.S., stating that this whole notion of sustainable agriculture is important when I go to retail and when I'm making the decision to purchase a particular food or beverage. So the opportunity is to capture that in a meaningful, relevant way. However, there exists some challenges. And I'm going to walk through some of those challenges as we get on further into the presentation itself. But I thought it important to show just a couple examples. And I'm sure many of you are familiar. This is Stonyfield Farm. They have this whole source map that they use that you can go back and actually source to see where some dairy products and peaches, pears, and raspberries are coming from in a variety of the products that they're using. And so if you look at another statement from consumers, I will choose products from sustainable sources over conventional ones. That continues to grow too. So again, you can see this momentum. You can see these things happening and bubbling in different parts of the world. Another good example, specifically within food and even outside food, is Unilever, which I'm assuming most folks are familiar with. I mean, the best practice here is immense in terms of their global impact. And the fact that they do have a variety of programs that have the consumer-facing component of which they are communicating such programs out to the general public. It's not just something that's being discussed with retailers and supply chain. Now, you can take a look at some best practices And at the risk of creating a revolt from Londoners and so on, it's always important to say there's a whole bunch of great stuff happening, but there needs to be, at times, some focus. There needs to be the acknowledgement that perhaps it's better to start small than big, and this whole area of increased involvement. And this is just an example of looking at something that, if it was meant to go wrong, it did go wrong in terms of their sustainability mission here. As they were looking at the Green Olympics, all the CO2, all the carbon offsets, the somewhat embarrassing PR, the transportation chaos, so on. All the various things that's happened there, which affects consumers' view of how they look at the world of sustainability. Now, you can get into a long discussion on, what impact does that have on them when they're at their supermarket and they're seeing all kinds of things here in terms of, maybe sustainability doesn't work. Maybe these ideas of carbon offsets are perhaps not a good way to look at this. And again, it leads to that confusion. So one of the things that's important to do is to recognize that within any population, in any geography, in any market around the world, even in this room, there are different strategies, different messaging, different communications, a whole variety of things, because we're all not created equal. So what we do at NMI is we actually break subpopulations or populations of countries down into various groups. And I'll show you more on the following slide, but the premise here is that on the top is really the greenest consumer. It's a part of the general public which is the greenest. They are very, very important in the fact that they are taking the messaging throughout the supply chain, from farmers and suppliers and retailers, and they're trying to process all this information. And what they're doing is they're driving that sustainability message to mainstream consumers. And I'll show you the percentages in a following slide. But what's important to understand is if you take the notion of sustainability, the motivations behind consumer interest, which hopefully is transferred into behavior, those motivations differ significantly. And again, this is relevant to any population. So if you look at any eco or social consumer-facing initiatives, one message is not going to appeal to all consumers, whether it's in this room or in the EU in total. Now, if you break the population down, I talked about this green consumer. We refer to it as the LOHAS consumer. And for those of you who are saying, where did LOHAS come from? The acronym stands for Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability. It represents about 1 of 5 consumers in any particular market. And again, they are the greenest at the top. Now you start going around counterclockwise here, and there's another group called the Naturalites. They are much more driven from personal health rather than the health of the planet. Not to say that sustainability is not important to them. They're just not balancing this whole connected points between personal health and planetary health together. There's a third group called the Drifters, a very interesting group. They tend to be a little bit younger. They tend to have more children. They are the green wannabes. They are a portion of the population that wants to get involved in sustainability, but it has to be something easy and relevant for them to do because of their hectic and busy lifestyles. Fourth, you have a group of consumers called the conventionals. And the conventionals are very interesting. They tend to have a higher income. They tend to be a little bit older. And the reason they're into sustainability is not necessarily because of an environmental impact, a social impact, but it's their own personal financial impact. So if I get involved in this world of green, it's because I can save some money. And if you think about it, that's fine. If I'm going to be a greener, I'm going to participate, that has a benefit to the entire ecosystem. And then there's a group that is just basically involved with basic living. So they're caught up with a lot of day-to-day challenges. But again, you can use this in any population around the world, keeping in mind that not all consumers are created equal. Now, how this works is very interesting. It's the premise of marketing. Take a lot of emerging products or categories or market sectors and generate awareness, trial, adoption, loyalty, and the influence on others. And it gets driven to mainstream. And there's lots of examples, whether it's organic or hybrid cars or solar panels or whatever it might be. And as I mentioned before, it's this LOHAS consumer that's driving that interest into the other three segments, those natural lights, conventionals, and drifters, which represent about 2/3 of any given population. So if you look at that from a generational standpoint, everybody around the world wants to talk millennials. Yes, they're an important group because they do represent more of the future. But you know, they're a very different group. What's nice is the linkage back to genuineness, the linkage back to transparency. It obviously ties back with the whole value statement around sustainability. And here we talk about the connectedness between value systems. So we're taking a consumer's morals and ethics, values and beliefs, and we're aligning them throughout the supply chain with manufacturers and suppliers and farmers and brands and so on. And it's giving that connection point that really drives them to change their behavior. They're a highly influential group. That's good and bad. Good news travels fast, but bad news travels even faster. And there's lots of adages around there. When consumers are happy, they'll tell 2 people. When they're not, they'll tell 20. So keeping that in mind is very important. They're obviously technological friendly, so a lot of the applications we talked about before need to meet that techno base. And they really understand this connection between world, environment, and people, whereby some of the older generations, which are not used to this globalization that we're living in now, just don't understand. And again, like I've mentioned before, we cannot forget about the social side. And when you're involved on the environmental side, that doesn't mean there can't be a social component to it, obviously. But I would just urge the connection between the two as we look at doing a lot of the challenges and objectives that Jason laid out before. So if you take a look at what the benefits of a sustainability platform to consumers are, there's 3 different elements here. One, it gives you higher perception. That perception relates back to quality. Another is higher trial. So when consumers are first using a particular product, gives them a higher likelihood to try. And then it's all about choice. Again, consumers are looking for that particular choice. But with all the opportunities come the recognition that if a consumer is choosing an environmentally friendly product, they don't want to give anything up. At least it will vary across those 5 groups I mentioned before. Those that are the greenest consumers are willing to give up a little bit more. Those, the further you get around the clock there, are less likely to give anything up. They're less likely to give up quality, less likely to pay more. And it's got to be just as convenient as all the other options that I'm looking for. And convenience means many different things, especially within the food industry. It's convenience of food access. It's the convenience of what do I do to it when I bring it home. It's the convenience of preparation. It's the convenience of eating. It's the convenience of cooking up. It's the convenience of what do I do with the packaging after I'm done with it. And it goes on and on. A lot of consumers, about half consumers around the world, don't want to give up anything. So when you're talking about these trade-offs, it's important to keep that in mind. So here we're talking about the global environmental concerns. I'll just, we tend to break things up between emerging and developed countries. I think it ties in very nicely to what Jason was talking about before, because if you look at the number one issue around the world, it is food safety, and this is just on the environmental side, not the social side. If you take a look at the developed countries, followed by global warming, third is deforestation, then you get into hazardous materials, water conservation and quality, and then lastly, overfishing. So those are the top 6 environmental issues, and they provide focus across the supply chain. Now, I also mentioned before that there's lots of stuff happening outside of the food industry. I think we're all well aware of that. This is just one that I chose. This happens to be Levi's, talking about the end of life. And it's highly relevant to food products, not only the waste issue, but packaging issues and all kinds of things. So they diverted to almost 24 billion pounds of clothing each year in U.S. landfills. Then this whole issue of water consumption as it relates back to denim jeans is definitely important and relevant. The challenge is getting the word out and getting consumers to understand that there is an issue. Because if consumers don't recognize that there is an issue, there is no problem. If there is no problem, they don't seek a solution. They're happy, they're satisfied. So there's nothing wrong with what I'm currently doing. Now this is, again, talking about the relevance here, and this is more of a macro level, but consumers are understanding the whole notion of global warming. It's a major problem that needs to be addressed quickly. It's gone up a little bit in the US, but the consumers are saying that they've changed their behavior. And they're beginning to realize that some of the headlines that they're reading, whether it's Manhattan going underwater or whatever it may be, that may have an impact on them. It may have an impact on themselves. It may have an impact of food pricing, whatever it may be. Across the globe, this whole notion of socially responsible business, again, you see this overriding theme of the higher relevance in emerging countries. So that needs to be important and kept in mind when you're talking about the difference between some EU countries or North America compared to some other markets. That the level of maturation and development drives consumer attitudes and behavior. Now, one of the reasons that consumers are getting involved is you're seeing all these different seals on all these different products that they're using. And these are just 3 of the 20 or so that are some of the larger ones. However, in the U.S., there's over 500 sustainability seals. So you wonder why it's a little bit confusing here. But I think most of you are familiar with these, whether we're talking about the relevance across the supply chain, farmers and farm workers, and biodiversity, and specific types of industries such as MSC. Now this is getting much more specific, but I thought it was relevant here. If we take a look at the reasons why consumers are purchasing food and beverage, and as they relate back to specific reasons why in terms of sustainability, you can see the list here of 10 things that they're looking at from from growth from 2007 to 2014. So you have free range and cage free is on the top, followed by certified organic, and then on the lower end is grown without pesticides, locally grown. Note that the attribute of organic, it's much more important to be organic and grown without pesticides. Lots of things happening there due to the regulations around the world in talking about organic to consumers based on all the regulations. This is just another example of almost what I talked about before with Stonyfield Farm. This is a smaller producer just acquired by Hormel, Applegate Farms, about an hour from our office. They use what they call the barn code. It shows you from what state or country the meat is sourced, and then they go one step further and they even talk about the attributes of that particular animal. You know, are we talking about humanely raised, which is always on the top? Are we talking about the use of hormones and antibiotics, which you can see on the top of their packaging? And then you have McDonald's. I think it's very, very interesting and you know, a good setup to the next speaker. You know, when they went through their whole transparency campaign, you know, they really understand what's happening here. And as they opened the books, they allowed consumers to say, okay, what's really in your products? Because there was some fundamental doubts, perhaps, that consumers had, which needed to be changed. Again, it's that difference between consumer attitudes and perceptions and the real truth on what's happening here. This is just the top 10 list. Again, this is US based, but there's definitely relevance here. We ask consumers who they think are the best global corporate citizens. And you end up with obviously a little bit of US skew because the number one is Whole Foods Markets, which again has some stores in the UK, but to my knowledge not in Ireland, but I think most of you are familiar with them. But it's very, very interesting. I think you would agree and understand why they're on the top of the list, followed by General Mills. McDonald's is very, very interesting. This is the whole difference between the environmental and the social side. This score in terms of being the number one corporate citizen of the 50 or so companies that we measured is driven from the social side of the equation. As are some other products and brands there. So it's a very, very interesting list. The whole notion of SC Johnson, that's driven by family, because that's what they chose. They chose and want to continue to communicate in a lot of outreach that they are a family company. And if you think about you know, the whole way back to where we started about with farmers and so on, the notion of local and family farms. Consumers can resonate with that. They understand what's going. They understand the family farm is disappearing and all those sort of notions. Now, consumers are finding most of the information in terms of sustainability. Yes, there's some importance in terms of advertisements, whether that be in magazines or newspaper or radio or TV or whatever it might be. We can't forget about the role of package label or websites or what's happening at retail. This is obviously important for retailers as you know, consumers are taking 3 seconds at shelf to choose a product. So we need to make it simple for them. And then I think most of you have heard about this nice, fun, global brand. You know, whether it's a lot of the quirky advertising that they do, but you know, I think it's a wonderful example how you can take a topic, pick GMOs. I mean, it's such a serious topic, and it's something that gets so emotional, sort of like talking about politics, and they can turn that into something that's perhaps a little bit engaging or different. So if you get to the end of the equation and you're trying to balance obviously the notion between people, planet, and profits, Sustainability from a consumer perspective is definitely here to stay. Consumers are feeling more responsible from a personal standpoint about sustainability. They're talking about the notion that corporate social responsibility is definitely having an effect on their purchase rates, and in the end, it is boosting return on investment. So it's a global shift that's here to stay, broad impact across the entire supply chain. But we need to take in mind that within any opportunity comes challenges, and we need to accept that no sacrifice mantra.